Hello and welcome to another edition of Globalistic Transfer Special. And this episode we're focusing on Celtic. And joining me today, Craig Turnbull, is David Friel. And David, we've just had some breaking news as we're going to record this. Benjamin Nygren has become Celtic's third summer signing. You just tell us about it. You're the man that broke the story.
Yeah, I mean, it's a few weeks ago now that we had the story, but as you say, Benjamin Nygren from Nordsjælland on a 5-year deal for Celtic. The fee will be around about £2 million, €2 million. I think it's a great piece of business. I think he's a player who has clearly done a lot in his career so far. He's broken out the Sweden squad, recently scored goals for Sweden. Really good in Denmark last year, 16 goals, can play as an attacking midfielder, number 10, number 8, or off a wing, even play up front as well. And, you know, reading Brendan Rodgers' quotes on him just before we come in here, Craig, referred to him as a quality player, and I think that's what Celtic are getting in Benjamin Nygren for an absolute steal at the price. And I think the big thing for me is he's a guy who I would look at and think he'll immediately come in and improve Celtic. This is no project, this is no squad player, this is a guy who'll come in and play for Celtic, and I think Celtic have pulled off a real transfer coup by getting him.
What do you think's attracted Nygren to Celtic?
It was really interesting. After the kind of news initially broke, he had done an interview with a Swedish channel and spoke about everything he wanted for his next club. He was very open that he was ready to leave Denmark and move. And he spoke about wanting to play under big pressure, wanting to compete for trophies, wanting to play in the Champions League, wanting to play in front of big crowds in a big stadium. So I think Celtic in that sense tick every box. Look, Celtic still have this Champions League playoff to try and get through. But I can imagine Brendan Rodgers, you know, Celtic sells itself to an extent. And I think for someone like him, Benjamin Nygren, who maybe wasn't going to get a top 4, top 5 Bundesliga club. He's probably in that kind of stage in his career where he wants to make a next step and just experience a bit more and gain better experience, especially at European level. I think Celtic ticks every box. And Brendan Rodgers is a manager who can develop players, who can help them progress and grow. And I think it's a perfect fit for everybody.
Yeah, and also a Sweden international as well. And how much of an influence do you think Brendan Rodgers has had in this move?
Yeah, it'd be huge, because you would imagine when Benjamin Nygren was allowed to go and speak to clubs, look, Brendan Rodgers in the past has always tried to have a chat, tried to have a sit down. If you can't meet them in person, probably have Zoom calls with potential targets. And just probably look through what he sees of them. He does his research on players, he'll know. But he can also look at players, whether it's at Celtic, whether it's at Liverpool, even further beyond at Swansea, that he has helped develop. So if you're looking at for a club, it ticks every box. If you're looking for a manager, head coach, it ticks every box for Benjamin Nygren, because Brendan Rodgers will make him better. And I think, as I said, I think it's a perfect fit. It's a really good signing for Celtic. And actually, you know, the transfer window's got a long time to go, but I actually think Celtic will do well to better the deal that they've got for Benjamin Nygren.
A 5-year deal, it's obviously one that, you know, it's a long-term plan.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I'm saying. He's only 23, but he said himself he's got over 200 games under his belt. We've been speaking to people in Sweden who he broke through in Gothenburg in their first team when he was 16 or 17. You know, he was really at that stage. Bayern Munich wanted him, Inter Milan wanted him, Man City wanted him. You know, he was one of the kind of hottest prospects in Europe. Okay, his career probably hasn't gone in the trajectory in terms of absolutely exploding at the highest level, but I think that may actually work in his favour. And the fact he's had to go and do the hard yards, you know, he went on loan to Heerenveen, he went to Genk initially, went on loan to Heerenveen, then went to Nordsjælland. He's had to go and really prove himself again, probably show his hunger and his ambition, and he's done that in Denmark, and I think now he's ready to just go and take the next step in his career.
Type of player it looks like he likes to get involved from the kind of right-hand side and cut in. And
yeah, but I do wonder, I mean, look, I'm sure we'll come on to Nicolas Kuhn, and he can clearly play in that kind of right wing, cutting in his left foot. He's a left-footed player. However, I wonder whether Celtic will play him as more of an attacking midfielder, maybe a Matt O'Reilly type replacement, that kind of idea. He can clearly score goals. I think what he's also got about him is a bit of personality. He was captain of Nordsjælland last year. I think that will help. As you said earlier on, he's a full Sweden internationalist now. So it's a complete package. You know, I know Johan Mjällby spoke a couple of days ago, Mark Reaper spoke, who'd watched him a lot in Denmark, and said he is the full package. That's a very good signing for Celtic. And like Brendan Rodgers has said, he's excited to see him start.
How do you assess the kind of transfer window or the business that Celtic have done so far?
I think it's been very good. I think you always look for, Ross Doohan came in, Scott Bain left for Falkirk, Ross Doohan comes in. Again, you're getting a guy who's just made his Scotland debut, knows the club, a really, really good addition to the kind of keeping squad. The goalkeeping area. You've got Kasper Schmeichel, Sinisalo and Ross Doohan. I think that made perfect sense. But you then look for players who are going to improve Celtic. Kieran Tierney will improve Celtic. Benjamin Nygren will improve Celtic. So clearly looking for other positions, other players. There might be some project signings arrive, guys that maybe not for the here and now, but are viewed more for the future, like Callum Osman from Fulham. However, I think if you just take Nygren and Tierney, I think Celtic are better than they were at the end of last season. So I think, really, really good business.
How big a window is this for Celtic in terms of Brendan Rodgers is coming in his final year of his contract? They have to kind of show backing, I guess, for him.
I do. I think so. But look, I don't think Celtic... Brendan Rodgers was back last year. I'm sure he'll be back again here. Look, he already has been back. I mean, Kieran Tierney is... Okay, it's a free transfer, but there will be a significant outlay in terms of just getting that deal done. Benjamin Nygren, again, you're getting him for cheap. And the kind of market value of him, but I'm sure the wages will be big to a point. You then look at other players coming in, and I'm sure Celtic will sign players. I think they'll spend a lot of money over the course of the window. However, I don't think you can say, it's Brendan Rodgers last year and what you're doing. I think Celtic just have to continue with the policy they've had, where you just try and get the best players for the best value. And I think if they keep doing that, it doesn't matter if Brendan Rodgers is here for another year or another 10 years. I just think Celtic have to continue with the model that they're going on and just look to improve the team. And that's what I'm saying. I don't think Celtic... There's always going to be room for guys for the future, like a Callum Osman. However, I think Brendan Rodgers and the board know that they need to strengthen in certain areas. They've already done that with Tierney and they've already done that with Benjamin Nygren.
Yeah, certainly have. And, looking, as we kind of touched on earlier, Nicolas Kuhn, there seems to be more interest in him, and there's a bit more momentum in this transfer in terms of it's building up. There's more interest.
Yeah, look, we had the story about Red Bull. It then came out that Red Bull Leipzig obviously want to take him back. In Italy, yesterday emerged that Como, Cesc Fabregas' side, are also very keen to bring him back, to bring him over to Serie A. Look, he's a player who had a brilliant, probably first 6-7 months of the season last year. He did tail off. That's undeniable. However, very talented player, a guy who was talking about Celtic's transfer model. Celtic signed for about £3 million. They could potentially make 5-6 times their money on him if he was to go this summer. However, it has to be in Celtic's terms. Where Nicolas Kuhn, and we've spoken in previous shows about, it would probably be an attractive proposition for him to go back to Leipzig, where it all kind of started for him over in Germany, and might feel that that's a better chance for him to work his way into the German national squad, which is one of his career ambitions, especially ahead of the World Cup next year. However, Celtic have got him a long-term deal. The terms have to be right if they are going to sell, and it has to be right for everybody. Now, if Nicolas Kuhn does want to go and makes it clear that Brendan Rodgers wants to go, I don't think Brendan Rodgers will stand in his way. You saw that with Kyogo in January. However, if Como are now in, that's maybe a win-win for Celtic, because you always want more interesting players in terms of the transfer phase. So we'll see how that one progresses over the next few weeks. My gut feeling is, come the end of the transfer window, Nicolas Kuhn won't be a Celtic player. Where he'll end up, I would probably say Leipzig are favourites right now, but we'll just see how it pans out.
Another one that pretty much seems to be heading out the door is Greg Taylor. Looks as though he's going to be away at PAOK.
Yeah, I mean, this has been going on and on and on. I mean, we spoke about Benjamin Nygren. I mean, this has been going on for months with Greg Taylor. I've said a million times, I think he's been a very good Celtic player. I also felt he had the right to weigh up his next move. He's got a young family. And I always felt that maybe abroad would be the best option for him. And it looks as if he is going to go to PAOK. In Greece, it looks like 3-year deals on the table for him. And good luck to him. Look, he's been a good Celtic player. He is someone who can look back with real pride in what he achieved at Celtic. But I always like to see Scottish players go and try things further afield. I think it's a really interesting move for him. I know there was interest from Croatia. I think there's been interest from America and England. But he clearly sees a project at PAOK, and it looks as if Greg Taylor's going ahead.
Does that mean that Celtic maybe need to look at that position? Obviously, they brought in Tierney to strengthen as well.
Yeah, I think it is one that they'll look at, but I just wonder at what level they look at. Do you go for someone experienced just to go and share the load with Kieran Tierney? Do you look for a young project? Do you look from within? I think it's one that Brendan Rodgers will weigh up. I would be astonished if Celtic went and spent big on another left back, a £5-6 million deal. I'd be surprised at that, but it might be one. I think we spoke last week with Ryan, that Celtic just maybe look at an up-and-coming player to go. And look, there's no doubt that Kieran Tierney won't be asked to play every single game for Celtic, so you do need someone, and that was Brendan Rodgers. Look, he's tried to keep Greg Taylor because he said there's enough scope for you to play a lot of games. I think Greg Taylor understood that as well, but there's no doubt Kieran Tierney, if it will be the first choice Celtic left back, but it's clearly an area Celtic will look at.
that brings us on to Shaun Maloney and how he's now returned to the club as a player pathway manager. So what can you tell us about that move and the role and what he'll bring to Celtic?
Yeah, I think it's a role that shouldn't be underestimated. I think it's a really important role, and I kind of, when Shaun got announced, I think there was a lot of people saying, "Oh, is it just job for the boys? He's a former player," and blah blah blah. I don't get that at all. I think Celtic, in that role, if you look at Shaun Maloney's credentials, I don't think you could have anyone better suited to take over from Darren Nadie. Now, Darren Nadie was obviously poached by Swansea City to be their number 2. Darren had been like Shaun, had been in there working with the young players. He had the background at Celtic, he had the international background. And whether they play for Celtic or not, I think in that role it's really important, because they can always, both Darren Nadie and Shaun Maloney, were able to go and speak of their own experience and be able to guide players. Now, Darren Nadie's left. Shaun Maloney, to me, ticks every box for that. You look at the experience he had as a player at Celtic, Aston Villa and beyond, 49 caps for Scotland I think he's got. He then played abroad. He has managed at Wigan, managed at Hibs, coached at Celtic before, but also coached the Belgium national team. So he's got a network of contacts, I'm sure. He knows what it takes to make it at Celtic. He also knows there'll be highs and lows along the way, and he'll be able to manage that. He's a really personable guy. Shaun Maloney, I think he'll be a guy who I would imagine will be able to get the best out of these young players and really guide them on the path. And I think beyond that, I think that job, it's not just, there's a stuff about loans and dealing with all that, but I think there's a bigger responsibility just in terms of shaping things. Work closely with Brendan Rodgers and Paul Tisdale and Chris McCartan and guys like that. But I think people can say, "Oh, jobs for the boys." I totally disagree. I think he's a very good candidate. I think he's a guy who, when he's not involved in football, he's a loss to the game, and I think he'll be excellent for Celtic.
You kind of touched on the significance of that role, and there was a report I saw by the Football Observatory which said that out with St Mirren last season, Celtic gave the least amount of minutes to players under the age of 21. So, we can see the idea behind this.
Yeah, and look, Brendan Rodgers has been asked about this quite a lot over the last while, and his answer's always the same. If you're good enough, you'll get your chance. And I think you saw that last year in terms of, it was probably limited minutes, like Jude Bonner, young Ricardo, and a few others, Francis Tully. They will get chances in this early stage of pre-season especially. They will, because the international players aren't back and Brendan Rodgers will mix it up. They need to seize that chance. You've had others in the past like Rocco Vata, Daniel Kelly, Ben Doak, who have decided to move on for maybe they think the pathway is better elsewhere. You look at Ben Doak, fair play, it worked for him. He's an absolute superstar now. Others, I think, have made the wrong decision. But I think in terms of working with Shaun Maloney, Brendan Rodgers, I think there will be a chance for these Celtic players. You just have to grasp it in the way that Kieran Tierney did, in the way Cal McGregor eventually did, in the way even Tony Ralston later on in his career has, and proved to be a really solid squad player for Celtic. But yeah, look, it's certainly an area that Brendan Rodgers wants to cultivate and develop, and I think having Shaun Maloney in there to help him and continue the work that Darren Nadie did will be very, very important. In
your mind, where do you think Celtic need to strengthen this window?
It's now. They will strengthen in the wide areas, and I think regardless of what happens with Nicolas Kuhn, Celtic need a bit more out there. We know Jota's out until 2026, probably, you would imagine. I've always felt that Celtic could probably do with a centre-half, a real partner for Cameron Carter-Vickers. However, that will maybe depend on others departing. And I don't mean that for financial terms, I just mean Celtic are so heavy in that area in terms of bodies. You've got Cameron Carter-Vickers, Liam Scales, Austin Trusty, Gustav Lagerbielke, Mike Nawrocki, Stephen Welsh, Dane Murray. That's 7. So I would imagine that Brendan Rodgers and the club will look to get 1 or 2 of them out and then make a decision on what they do. I would personally strengthen in that area if possible, but I understand that you need to manage a squad and you need to look at that. And I think Gustav Lagerbielke was at FC20 last year on loan. We thought that was maybe going to turn into a permanent one. It didn't, but Braga in Portugal are now quite keen on him as well, so I would imagine he will go. But Celtic may get a bit of money. Let's talk maybe £1.5 million move to Braga if that comes off. So I definitely think there'll be a bit of turnover in that area, but I would look at centre-half. I've always felt Celtic needed a bit more strength, a more kind of defensive-minded player in midfield for certain games, and I think Brendan Rodgers in the past has been asked about this and has said that, well, look, I don't always. Cal McGregor plays in it. I don't really need one for the Premiership. I think in certain European games he probably does. Whether you would think that justifies a major outlay, I don't know. But there'll still be areas that Brendan Rodgers will look to, and I also think he'll sign another striker.
Yes, and they look as though they're kind of tapping into the Japanese market again. We kind of exclusively brought to the Shin Yamada.
Yeah.
Is going to be is certainly on the radar. What can you tell us about?
I think he's obviously one who is. It's a strange one because I suppose based on his form this season, you would maybe kind of scratch your head and think, well, why would you be interested? But I think you need to look back to last season. I think you need to look back at his goal return last season, which was outstanding in the J League, 19 goals. And I think he's also one that don't be fooled by his lack of experience at 25. It's a Japanese system. He goes through university. If you look at the profile of him, he's pretty quick, strong, stocky. Seems very suited to European football, very suited to Scottish football. And I think it's also quite interesting in terms of, I don't think the fee would be huge. So, you look at what Celtic got, Ryo Hayato and Daisen Maeda, and even Kyogo was a wee bit more, about 4 million, but still good value. And I just look at, I know Celtic have been scouting Japan and looking at it. They're looking at Inamura as well from Niigata, central defender. Again, I think he would certainly be one with an eye to the future if that happens. But in terms of Yamada, to me, he is a guy who could suit Scottish football, and I can understand why his form and his progress, okay, it's maybe started a bit this season, has alerted scouts, and it's not just Celtic, the other European clubs looking at him, because I think he's a player who seems ready for a move to Europe, and I think he's a guy who, for a relatively low fee, could certainly do a job.
And they've got Maeda and Ida, so where does he kind of fit into all that?
Well, I think that's what I'm saying. I do wonder about Johnny Kenny. I know there has been interest, and I think Celtic need to probably decide what they're going to do with Johnny Kenny. Is it a loan? Do you take a permanent maybe offer that will come in for him? I think Daisen Maeda will still probably flit, especially with Jota being out between left wing and centre forward. And so I would then look at Callum Osman, very young, not a lot of first team experience. I think it's a big ask to ask him to be going and playing regular minutes, especially in his first season. So I would think Celtic would look for another striker. Brendan Rodgers did say towards the end of the season, it is easier to get a kind of quality winger for a certain level of money than it is to get a quality striker. I'm talking about top quality striker. So I would look at someone like Yamada or other guys of that ilk as someone who would maybe fit the bill.
Couple of other names I'm going to throw out there that seem to be connected and never kind of go away: Michel-Ange Balakwisha and Sondre Orja-Seta.
Yeah, I mean, Balakwisha is certainly one that's been watched, and I think he's only got a year left in his deal. He's had a lot of injury problems. I think he's a player that Celtic have liked for a while. I would wonder whether the fee that Antwerp are looking for just now, whether it's Celtic or other interested parties, will start to go down towards the end of the window. I think they're asking for, according to colleagues in Belgium, they're wanting €5 million or £5 million or whatever it is, and I think that's maybe a bit steep given his contract situation and his injury record. So I would keep watching that. And Orja-Seta, I'll try and pronounce that properly. I think he's also been linked with PSV, and clearly a player of potential, of quality. However, I think you would maybe look at that one and say, is there our interest? What else? And Celtic, again, a player that Celtic have been linked with and reportedly looking at in other windows. I just wonder how that will pan out over the course of the next couple of months, especially if there's kind of major interest from PSV at a certain level. Yeah.
And, there's been rumours as well about Cameron Carter-Vickers. He's been linked with Leeds and Sunderland. How important is he? Charlie Mulgrew described him as worth his weight in gold.
Yeah, he's so important, and that's actually, think, what will help Cameron Carter-Vickers get into this season is he didn't have to go away with America. He was able to get a proper rest after the Scottish Cup final, and I think with a strong pre-season, injury-free, he's had some injury problems over the last couple of years. I think that will do him the world of good. And look, I expect another strong season from Cameron Carter-Vickers at Celtic. I don't expect him to be sold. I don't even expect it to be on the agenda. I think he'll be at Celtic for the foreseeable future. And yeah, look, he's the number one central defender there. He's such an important player for Brendan Rodgers and the club. And look, I think it's just a case of who partners him.
Yeah. And finally, it would be remiss not to pay tribute to Lisbon Lion legend John Clark. Just to tell us a bit about him.
Yeah, I mean, it was really, really sad news to hear about John at the start of the week. And we've just spoken, Craig, about 1 million players and some will come and go and some will arrive, some will never arrive, and a lot of them will just be kind of footnotes in Celtic's history. And I think if you look at a guy like John, a Lisbon Lion, but that only tells half the story really. You know, he was a European champion for Celtic, but I think he basically represented the club or worked for the club for about 50 years across, I think it spanned even 8 decades. He pretty much did every job, you know. He was an outstanding player next to Billy McNeil on that side. He was coach, he was assistant manager, he then came back in as kit man, I think the late 1990s, and was basically a kind of fixture around the club in that role for so many years, worked with so many managers. And in this job, you kind of get to, we're lucky enough to go and interview and get to know some of these guys a wee bit. And John was one that I kind of did get to know, and he was just such a humble guy. See, for a footballer of that status and that pedigree and background, he would just tell you stories and anecdotes. He's a real kind of dry sense of humour at times, John. He was always at the wind-up. And as I said, you know, me and the guys at the paper have spoken to John over the years so many times, and he always had a laugh with you, and he was a really, really nice guy. And I just think it's, when you look at the constant thread through Celtic's history with John in terms of from the 60s and into the 80s and then in the modern day, and you look at some of the great Celtic games even in the last 20 years, I mean, big goals are scored. Cameron always goes to the bench, and 9 times out of 10, John Clark's still sitting there, and you just think it's just an amazing life story. He's got, you know, even when he was younger, he kind of overcame real personal tragedy and everything to become an unbelievable footballer. And I think he's a real loss to Scottish football, a real loss to the club. He'll be sorely missed around the place. When we would go on the trips, you would always have a wee chat with John and stuff like that. And just a really, really nice guy. And I think just on behalf of everybody at the paper, and Scottish Sun in general, I think just our condolences to his family.
Yeah, a Lisbon Lion legend in every sense of the word. And David, thanks so much for your time today, and thank you for watching at home. Don't forget to go to the SunSport YouTube channel where there's lots more exclusive content, and of course keep up to date across all Sun platforms for football transfers, rumours, news and gossip.